and the loss and damage. But this is something that has not progressed much. At COP28, we had countries actually adopt the loss and damage fund, but we're still struggling with the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. Recently seeing the US backing down of the loss and damage fund, and also other countries not being able to actually meet their commitment for climate financing. This is to say that the policies are there. It's about the political will, and it's about the leadership to make sure that these policies that are already in place are implemented. Because these are just a piece of paper. If the papers, they're there and we're not making the best use of it, then we are not making enough progress. And as a young person that has actually worked in the climate space, leading an NGO, but also working in the multilateral space as one of the advisors to the UN Secretary General, and also working with other young people around the world, our message has been clear since the start. We've used different approach from young people in the West protesting, because that is one of the best means or ways they can be able to see action from the politicians, from young people in Africa actually leading NGOs, working with communities that are impacted, and also leading innovations through technology, working with schools, among others, to create awareness and ensure their advocacy efforts strengthen. The message has been clear, is that we need to ensure there is transparency and accountability in the climate space. And when we talk about that, it's making sure that we are holding leaders accountable. Todd has mentioned that politicians, what they know is, they don't want to fail, because if they fail, they will become ex-politicians. And we have seen how young people have been in the forefront, ensuring that there is transparency. There is ensuring that at least the commitments that have been made are fulfilled. And that is one of the roles that young people have actually brought in the space. But this is not the role of young people. It's the role of every single person, from the civil society space, from the private sector, from the businesses, academia, etc. Because this is a collective effort. It is not an individual effort. And to add on to that, Marlene, you've mentioned the issue of energy access and technology. And I agree with you that the technologies are there also. It's about making sure that these technologies are accessible to the people that actually need it the most and are impacted. For instance, in Africa, over 600 million people still do not have access to electricity. Even though Africa is a continent that is blessed with natural resources like solar, but over 600 million people still do not have access to electricity. And over 900 million people do not have access to clean cooking, showing that people still use biomass, especially firewood and charcoal, to cook. So it shows that for us to ensure that there is effective transition in our climate action, especially, and also energy transition, we need to make sure that people that are most impacted are not left behind. Because if we leave the people most impacted, then we are going to face economic challenges. We are going to face other challenges that will significantly impact us, because then jobs will not be available, among others. So we need to make sure that climate action is not something that will be competing with wars or military issues. It's not something that we can pose or defer for another time until we address other issues. It is something that needs to be continually addressed, because the climate crisis is not waiting for anyone. It is going to impact people. The sea level rise are going to increase. The land degradation, the conflicts, among others, the migrations are going to increase. So what we need to do is to make sure that we take climate action, especially climate justice, as a priority in our approach as countries, as businesses, as civil society leaders, among others, to ensure that people impacted the most are affected, but also the major contributors are held accountable for the damages of the climate that we're facing all around the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatu. Passion and eloquence is a very good combination. Laura, please, over to you.
And thank you, Fatu. And I want to focus my comments on the role that the law can play to galvanise, to help galvanise that collective effort, to secure the climate justice that we need, and to really focus in on that accountability of political leaders and businesses in doing their part in the transition. The law can really help build in that long-term thinking, for intergenerational thinking for current and future generations that we need as a balance to that short-term thinking that we have in our politics and in business. So I'm going to talk about the role that international courts can play, the importance of climate laws at the national level, the role that how law is being used at the local community level, and then briefly on the leadership we need to see and are seeing from corporates, and what happens when we don't see that. So internationally, and in thinking about international courts, last year was a really big year for climate action in international courts. We saw the Klimaseniorinnan, the elderly Swiss women, win a case at the European Court of Human Rights, essentially saying that the Swiss government had a duty to protect the human rights of its citizens, and it needed to do much more to address climate change. Now, that ruling is legally binding or it sets a precedent across all of the Council of Europe, all Council of Europe member states, and we're already seeing follow-up cases building on that. So really crystallizing the fact that states have a human rights obligation to take action on climate change. Then in terms of the international courts, we've got two really important advisory opinions. So the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea issued an advisory opinion last year saying that essentially greenhouse gases constitute marine pollution for the purposes of the law on the sea, and states have a legal obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and tackle climate change under that law. This year we're going to be hearing the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which has, following leadership from Pacific Island students, government of Vanuatu and others, will be producing an advisory opinion on the obligation of states in respect of climate change, and what are the consequences when states do not meet those obligations in terms of the impact on states, but also particularly the impact on small developing states, small island developing states, but also the current and future generations impacted by climate change. So there, again, we then see the human rights element coming through. Now, advisory opinions are, of course, soft law. You could say, well, why should we care? It's soft law, it's not legally binding, there's no enforcement mechanism. But advisory opinions like this are really authoritative statements of international law. They can create pressure from above on states to take action. They can also inform litigation if states don't step up. And many of our national laws have really developed from these sorts of international norms like this. So it's really something to watch. What pressure can we bring from above from international courts to accelerate action and implementation? Then at the national level, of course, this is going to be the implementation COP, this is the decade of implementation. National climate laws can really help close that gap between international commitments and what actually happens on the ground. So it's one thing to go to a COP and make an NDC, it's another to actually turn that into real economy action. So national climate laws provide that framework for a whole of economy transition. They provide stability and certainty for business and finance, and they kind of remove climate action from the politics to a certain extent. And the IPCC has been very clear that, that national climate laws help deliver both mitigation and adaptation outcomes. Countries that have national climate laws are doing better at reducing greenhouse gases. Currently, 60 countries have got national climate laws, and that number is increasing, most recently in Chile with its framework law on climate change, and South Africa with its new climate law. So Client Earth is working with global legislators, WWF International and others to really build support in the number of countries that are bringing in their own national climate laws. And then finally, at the level, there's huge action there. We're working Client Earth with local communities, indigenous peoples in West Africa, in Ghana, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, supporting them on forest governance reform, forest protection, integrity of timber supply chains, for example. So we're seeing increasingly more and more people at multiple levels using the law to really drive this real world action. And then finally, just briefly, corporate leadership is so important. We don't make this transition without corporates really showing the way. And while we're seeing at the political level a retreat from ESG in some parts of the world, and the EU, we're seeing a potential watering down of the Green New Deal, we are also seeing businesses saying, no, actually, we need these high ambition regulations. There is no, to put it bluntly, there is no profit on a dead planet. We need to see companies really internalizing and taking action on the very, very real risk that climate presents to their long-term commercial viability. And we're seeing leadership from a number of companies. IKEA, for example, has reduced its climate footprints by 24% since 2016, grown its business by 31%. But we're also seeing corporate laggards, of course, those that are deploying climate obstruction like greenwashing, false solutions, disinformation, or those that are continuing to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure. And so for those, we'd say actually the law plays a critical role in holding companies to account when they are not doing the right thing, when they are pulling in the wrong direction, so that we can accelerate the transition by really holding them to account. So I think just in closing, the COP President-designate has talked of the need for a movement of movements to build a better future. And increasingly, the law is being used across society by young people and old Indigenous peoples, community groups, to really design the future that we need. Because at this essence, law is an expression of what society wants, what we need collectively. And at this point, halfway through the critical decade, that's more important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Please join me in a clap for our speakers. Before I go to questions from the audience, and please do start getting those questions in your mind ready, I'd like to use my prerogative as chair to ask a question. This is, Fatou, this is mainly directed at you. And I'm a bit surprised our audience didn't pick up on this, given our keynote speaker, Ana Toni, in the first session. The Guardian ran an article at 7 o'clock this morning picking up on lines from an interview with Ana, in which she states, wars come and go, climate change is here for a long time. We need to take climate change very seriously, otherwise we have even more wars in the future. Fatou, I wonder, how can we ensure those sorts of incredibly important messages really land not just with the public, but the entire society, investors, etc., such that we accelerate the rate of the energy transition and the wider transition, and that your message really starts to cut through and we accelerate?
Thank you so much, Dan. I mean, she is right. Wars come and go, but the climate crisis will continue to exacerbate. It's been getting worse. The IPCC report has shown that. We're seeing that happening in real life in our countries and in our communities. So what I say, because recently I was invited to the World Economic Forum, speaking to businesses and other stakeholders that were present. And my message was actually clear and consistent throughout, that ESG is not a tick box that you just go and, okay, I'm just trying to fulfill, so I'll just tick a box. No, it's not about that. Laura has mentioned that there is no profit on a dead planet. So what I think we need to do, especially in making sure that we are communicating this across the board to people that are impacted, to governments, to other stakeholders and partners, is that we need to make sure that people understand what is happening, especially the realities. Because sometimes it's difficult for people to understand if they do not understand the realities of what is happening. And that is why for us, as civil society that have worked mainly with communities that have been impacted, we have continued to consistently communicate to them how important it is for us to build our resilience, because maybe the governments will not do it, but if we work together in a collaborative approach, making sure that we are bringing on board every single person that is concerned, it could help in making sure that there is more climate action, but particularly community-driven climate action. And that is what we have been doing, communicating with communities and ensuring that we help them understand that this is not an individual fight, it's a collective fight, and we need every single stakeholder on board. And also in our communication with policymakers, because before I've served in this role, I have been with Yongo, which is the official youth constituency of the UNFCCC, and as observers, we have been in the negotiation rooms actually listening to the conversations that have been happening. And we always make sure that, at least when we're engaging leaders, is to make sure that they understand that this is about their people. This is not about profit or anything. It's about the people that you are there to represent. So I think it's very important that when you're communicating to different groups to have different messages, because when you have different messages, it helps them to understand and put themselves in the shoes of the people that are impacted. So I think it's about the kind of messaging that you do and the approach that you use to communicate to these people to help them get them on board, but also to listen and take action.
Thank you. Can I see questions? I've got one at the front. Yeah, so we'll go 1, 2, 3, please, and when you're stating your question, please do try and keep them to concise questions rather than long statements. And name and affiliation, please.
Ben Cook here from the Times. I've got a question mainly for Laura. We've seen this morning that Kemi Badenoch has announced that the Tories are going to be are no longer going to be committed to net zero by 2050. I was just wondering whether you have any comments on that in relation to what you were saying about the importance of national climate laws.
Thank you very much. And then I think we had a gentleman at the right-hand side over here, please.
Hi, I'm Joe Lowe, a journalist from Climate Home News. A question for Marlin. The International Maritime Organization are discussing a shipping emissions levy. I understand your company makes shipping engines. There's debate about what the levy should be spent on. Should it be spent on loss and damage, or should it stay in the shipping industry and be used to kind of clean up shipping? And I wondered if you had a view on that.
And then we had a lady in the middle at the back.
Thank you. Danny Harris from Jacobs. A simple question. I think we are facing a schism in the population between people who get this, like everyone in this room, and people who don't see the immediate benefit in the frame of, immediate difficult economic situations. So I guess, how do we keep them on board, driving forward and supportive of what we're all trying to achieve?
Great, thank you. 3 very different questions. I think we'll take them in order, if that's all right. Net zero and the Conservatives, Laura, first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want, if I can just sort of zoom back a bit and just pick up on what Fatih was saying about, and what you were saying about security. If we understand security, we understand that we need to also be thinking about energy security and the well-being and the cost of living for individual citizens. And I think that's critically important as governments are increasing spend on security, a maximalist understanding of that it's not about tanks and guns. And, well, it needs to be hard power, but it needs to also be investing in the transition, and that's critical. On the question about the opposition and that sort of opening position, I think that, a few years is a long time in politics, right? And I think we will see that position evolve. It's a big shame that we've lost that bipartisan approach to climate change that we had in the UK for a very, very long time. And, I think that when you look at how the Climate Change Act has helped to reduce emissions, and the recent advice from the Climate Change Committee on its 7th carbon budget saying actually the cost of the transition is so much less than people thought it was going to be even a few years ago, I think that there's a sort of momentum underway anyway in terms of how the transition is working that is going to be very hard to stop. So, of course, I think we will see that push to the sort of anti-net zero, that's, in terms of the politics. But I'm really hoping that that position evolves to understand, well, what is the impact on individual people who need to see this action? You also then have the role of the courts, and Clan Earth, along with Friends of the Earth and the Good Law Project, has twice won a case against the UK government for its inadequate net zero strategy under the Climate Change Act. This new government has until May to produce a revised and fit-for-purpose net zero strategy. So I'm hopeful that that combination of what the public need to see and will, I hope, increasingly demand in terms of energy security, combined with that legal, the courts holding governments to account, will provide that longer term thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Todd, just to tee you up, I'm going to bring you in on the schism between those who get it and keeping people on board. But before we do that, Marlin, shipping levy, and also we've got a question online about artificial intelligence that I'm going to throw your way as well, if that's all right, which is, how do you envision artificial intelligence contributing to accelerating the energy transition, particularly in light of the geopolitical rivalries shaping AI development? So shipping and AI accelerating the transition, if that's okay.
Yes. Thank you very much for the questions. So on the question on IMO and shipping levies, now I am from Wärtsilä Energy, but luckily actually very recently had a discussion with my counterpart in Wärtsilä Marine on this very topic, so I feel somewhat confident I can still give a good reflection at least on it. So obviously, so Wärtsilä is a big player in the marine industry. So just for context, I think about 1/3 of the ships that are trafficking the world globally has our equipment on it, and the sort of IMO emission limits and policies that have been put in place have really been driving decarbonization efforts across the marine industry, and we've seen that. We've seen increasing demand for efficiency solutions, increasing demand for sustainable fuel-ready engines, and these kinds of solutions that do help accelerate the transition of shipping, green shipping, and also sort of make it future-ready or future-proof, or even more sort of actions in the future. Now on the levy, and not to get into details, I mean, loss and damage may for sure be needed, but perhaps my comment would be that personally, I really believe that these sort of consistent, stable, predictable market rules are what also allows companies to innovate and for change to happen. So if rules like emission limits and if funds for creating that kind of market demand, I think are actions that can really effectively and efficiently sort of also drive new technology, drive innovation, drive the actual implementation of technologies that we have already, because they also need to scale up. So I think I would sort of go back to my comment in my opening statement and say that if we can create market demand for these solutions, that will actually really help them scale, and that's also then how private sector can play a role, because you need those solutions to still play in a commercial environment. They need to be competitive, and if you can sort of get to that point, then you can really kind of achieve things a lot faster. On the other question, do I continue on that?
Yeah,
so potential of AI to accelerate the energy transition.
The transition, particularly in light of the geopolitical rivalry shaping AI development.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting flavor to the question. I mean, it was mentioned earlier, of course, that data centers and AI are driving an increase in energy demand, and obviously there is concern as well that not all of this additional demand will be met with renewable sources, and concerns about almost this sort of like step back in that sense. But I think it was also addressed in kind of very good ways. I've heard it said, and I tend to agree that there is the positive side of that coin as well, that there is a lot of potential in AI to actually speed up things, to come with new solutions. Maybe that doesn't happen immediately, but if you try to sort of size these effects, and AI if it does have the potential to kind of help move the energy transition as a whole, to help efficiency improvements, to help optimization of energy networks, to help energy efficiency, if we can leverage it for that, that's probably going to more than offset any kind of temporary increase or fossil fuels being used to power those. So so there is that really positive potential of that technology as well. Now, more in the context of geopolitics and rivalry, generally I think the energy transition and sort of moving towards more renewables is not going to be a winner in a kind of more complex trade environment with rivalry, with kind of trade wars. I mean, tariffs will make everything more expensive. It will make it much more challenging. And if we break supply chains and make it much harder to source across, I also see sort of real risks for that kind of impeding the speed of progress. But naturally, there's other concerns that need to be taken into account as well. But I would say that generally, let's say, functioning supply chains, open trade environments, less protectionism, while that doesn't look so likely right now, I'd say that's kind of the best case scenario for the energy transition as a whole, and also probably for the potential for AI to actually contribute to that.
Thank you very much. Todd, can I bring you in on the schism between those who get it and keeping people on board, please?
Yeah, sure. It's the $64,000 question. I mean, this is the thing that is, in many respects, most important. It's about building norms, about norms becoming stronger. And we've seen this historically in all kinds of ways. I mean, we saw it in the example that I gave about the original Earth Day. We've seen it in areas that are completely different from what we're talking about in the acceptance of same-sex marriage. Certainly, this was huge in the United States. Women's rights, still a long way to go, but a long way that's been traveled. So these things can happen. And with climate change, the thing that is the kind of diabolically difficult problem with climate change is that it is the problem that never feels like you have to act on it today rather than tomorrow. And when we saw very different setup with respect to the COVID pandemic, I mean, there were steps taken in cities of 10 million people. Nobody in their right mind would have predicted before COVID came along that leaders would step out and close down cities of 10 million people overnight. People would have thought you were crazy if you even talked about that. COVID came. COVID was absolutely immediate. COVID presented a risk to politicians of a plague running through their cities, and then they acted. So climate change always has that problem. Climate change, there's few things more dangerous over time than climate, but you've got that to work against. I think there's a norms change on a basis of many different kinds of things. When there's a energy transition is bringing electric vehicles and all sorts of other things, renewable energy, into common use, that those things become more accepted by people. If you have leaders that there are too many leaders who don't step forward, some who do, that obviously helps. There is the kind of action again that I talked about with respect to the 1970 Earth Day. Action in the street, so to speak, but also not in a way that's going to turn off everybody who's not already on your team. I mean, that's not the right way to go. But on the other hand, publicizing and making clear what can be done, it's hard work. I mean, as Rachel, Kyte, and Ana Toni said, it's not easily done. But this is as important as anything else. This basic, why do some people feel it and some people don't? This is the big question of what's got to be done moving forward.
Thank you, Todd. Let's go back to the audience. I've got one question over here to my left and one at the front and one here. If we could go in that order, if that's all right, that'd be great.
Hello, Rose Amy at Power for People. What consideration is being given to community-owned renewable energy generation schemes as a mechanism to bring down energy costs and create localized energy security? And also, what efforts are being completed to bring these community groups into these discussions, and particularly on the point of pushing the political will of politicians? Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think, did we have one here, or sorry, was it here? Sorry, at the front. Thanks.
Hi, Sarah Roberts from Practical Action. We work in Africa, Asia and Latin America with communities who haven't got climate justice or energy justice, and it's good to hear you talking about things like the real lack of clean cooking that's still there in Africa. So we see lots of pathways to change, but lots of factors ranged against it. So my question was building on a comment that Laura made, that we need a movement of movements to build a better society. And we're seeing some real challenges to movement building in lots of places we work. So I'd just like to hear the panel's thoughts about how do we do that? Because I think those of us who've been working on this for a long time need to find different sets of alliances and different ways to make progress. Thank you.
Thanks. And then I think we had one over here.
Hi, Sam Dick, Global Witness. So talking about Ukraine, I don't think it took anyone by surprise that states are looking to secure their mineral supply chains. I think what took people by surprise, including publics who don't pay attention to critical minerals, is whose safety and security is so blatantly going to be sacrificed. I suppose my question is, do we think we're in a new era where the just transition is at risk of coming at the expense of people's safety and security rather than benefiting them?
Thank you very much. 30 seconds to answer these. So Laura, on community-owned renewables, I just want to put a geopolitical framing around that, which is that we have to appreciate that investment growth in the energy transition is slowing pretty much everywhere. And so there is a role for, I think, for more community-owned renewables to supplement what we are witnessing, which is a slowdown in the energy transition, particularly in the West due to high interest rates. So Laura, we'll go to you on that. Fatu, movement of movements, and I'll come very quickly to the Ukraine CRM question. Laura.
Thank you. And I'll touch on the movement of movements question as well, because they're linked. You know, my feeling is what we need is an increasing number of people who feel like they are able to have agency in some way, right? That the transition is not something that is done to you, that you can you might want to resist, but how do people in different ways locally take action? And it might be, you know, advocating on clean air or using litigation, but lots more and more people, you know, can get involved, and I think that helps keep that momentum going. And one really neat example is this growth in energy communities, so local groups who invest in and manage local renewable energy provision. That's hugely important. Client Earth are trying to support that development, but it needs the right regulatory framework to make it happen. But again, for me, it's about, you know, people always often sort of say, well, you know, what can I do as an individual level? Individuals can get involved in different initiatives, have agency that helps drive that systemic change.
Thank you. Fatu, probably about 15 seconds.
What? Yes, on the movement of movement, what we need to understand is that people bring different perspectives and they bring in different contribution to addressing the climate crisis. For instance, in local communities, we've seen how indigenous people continue to use their local knowledge in climate adaptation, especially in farming practices, among others. So it's about leveraging the skills, the experiences, and the local knowledge that people have, and make sure that we're bringing this across the board. So it's about making sure that every single person has a role and a contribution to play. I'm not done, but yes. Yeah. On the just transition question, how do we make sure it's not affecting people's safety and security? I always say this, it's about making sure that just transition is ensuring there is economic growth. And it's also about bringing every person on board. In terms of the economic growth, we understand that in our transition to just economies, a lot of people will lose their jobs because most of them were dependent on fossil fuel, especially countries that are mainly dependent on oil and gas exploration as their main economies. And so it's about making sure that these people are brought forward, especially in terms of economic growth and also access to green jobs so that they don't live in poverty. Well, yeah. Sorry about it. Yeah, well, but we can have a conversation after this, and I can provide more clarity. I think I've exhausted my 15 seconds, but yeah.
It's okay, it's okay. Your eloquence and passion gets you, yeah, a lot more. Please do speak to Fatou afterwards if you want to speak to her, as well as the other panellists. Ukraine CRM, I think it's a red herring. It's going to take a hell of a long time to develop those assets. We're talking at least 15, 20 years. Most of the CRM is actually in Russian-controlled areas. It's a way of playing Trump. With that, I think we'll leave it. And yeah, please join me in thanking our panelists. Sorry, before you do, I must remember the message from Amy, which is that we want to share a quick video on these screens. Okay, we're sharing a quick video on these screens about one climate solution you'll see at today's event, and you can explore more at the Kew Gardens exhibition upstairs. Before we show the video, please thank our panellists.
$2 billion cups a day, sustaining 25 million livelihoods and supporting a global industry of more than $200 billion. Coffee. But the main species that we drink are threatened by climate change. Coffee production is also a major cause of deforestation and biodiversity loss. In 2014, Kew scientists joined forces with local partners and union hand-roasted coffee in the Yayu Biosphere Reserve in Ethiopia. Coffee farming traditionally contributed to 70% of the local income. Back then, the forest was under threat. Farmers were struggling to make sufficient income from coffee, so faced having to clear space for other crops. Yayu is also home to wild Arabica coffee. The project showed that farmers could switch to specialty forest coffee, eventually boosting their income by 120%. And now satellite data has shown that the forest cover of Yayu's wild coffee farms is similar to the forest's core. The higher the price for coffee,